So hi, welcome everybody. My name is Laura Horwood-Benton, and with me also is Heather Armitage from the Portsmouth Public Library, and we'll introduce our panelists in just a second. One note before we start, we have turned on subtitles for this evening for improved accessibility. So if you would like to turn those off or on, you should look for the button that says hide subtitle to turn them off or show subtitle to turn them on. And that should be at the bottom of your screen. If you can't see it, it might be in the three dots that say more on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I'd like to start this evening with our land acknowledgement. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people, who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who call themselves Wabanaki, or people of the dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land, which is especially relevant, I think, to a conversation about grief. So this event will last until about 7:30 p.m. and we plan to be respectful of your time. If you have questions about library services or upcoming programs, please feel free to ask us at the end. This is a webinar, so while we cannot see your video or hear you, you are welcome to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll make sure that our panelists see them. We are recording this event and we'll be putting it on our YouTube page, so we encourage you to share it later. And we love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library, so I will also share in the chat an event feedback form. If you fill it out, you'll not only help the library, you will also be entered to win a library book bag. So look for that link in a few minutes. I did also want to tell you that if this program makes you think about your own death or the death of loved ones, we invite you to another program next month, A Good Death, a panel for end-of-life options. And that is on Wednesday, October 13th at 6:30 p.m. I don't have the registration link yet, so we will have that later this week. I encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter because that's the best way to get all of the information about upcoming programs at the library. So I will be sharing that link in the chat as well. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Heather.
Hello, thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone for attending. I would like to thank Hospice Help Foundation for all they do and for their time, care, and energy in gathering this group of knowledgeable humans to share their insights and experiences about navigating grief and loss during COVID. I would also like to welcome tonight's panelists. Pat Coughlin is a hospice social worker with Constellation Hospice. She is a certified death doula, a death cafe facilitator, and has provided support and compassion to hospice and palliative care patients for decades. Jeff Pelkey established the J.S. Pelkey Funeral Home in 1999. He enjoys serving his community in several ways, including as 36-year veteran police officer, firefighter, and public safety chaplain. He was honored as the youngest Fabian Drake Award recipient in Elliott. Carol Schoneberg has been a hospice educator and grief counselor in Maine for 30 years. She is currently end-of-life educator, bereavement services manager, and grief counselor at Hospice of Southern Maine. Since its inception in 2004, she believes strongly that helping people talk about their choices for end-of-life care can make a huge difference in the way families experience the dying process. Tonight's moderator is McSally, president of the board of Hospice Health Foundation. She is a retired pediatrician with a master's degree in public health. While her clinical background is in primary care and public health, Anne has received extensive training as a hospice volunteer and grief support peer facilitator for both children and their families. Thank you all for this evening of reflections and for sharing your time and insights with us. And now to Anne.
Thank you so much, Heather, and welcome everybody. And thank you to our speakers in advance. We're so glad to have you with us this evening and share all of your expertise and knowledge. I just would like to take a quick moment and mention to the audience that Hospice Help Foundation is a nonprofit based right here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We work with hospices throughout the state to boost the comfort and the dignity of hospice patients who are struggling with poverty. And we do that by funding essential items that patients would not otherwise be able to afford, such as rent, heat, and modest last wishes. And we also partner with wonderful organizations like the Portsmouth Public Library in order to help people have an opportunity to speak about death and dying and all of the issues that may surround those topics, either for the individuals and or for the families. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to our audience for joining us. So with that, we will go to our first speaker, Pat. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As Heather said, I'm a hospice social worker. I've been doing it for about 30 years now. I see people at home, and I see people in nursing homes. And as we all know, nursing homes are very affected by the COVID virus. But as I was thinking about this talk and what I wanted to talk about, I felt that the grief issues were deeper and more profound than I think any of us thought of at the beginning of the pandemic, the effect it was going to have on all of us. I know for myself, I was furloughed early on in the pandemic, and I was home alone by myself for 5.5 months in my apartment, running out to get groceries, running back. And I felt this profound feeling of sadness over kind of losing, even though it was temporary, I hoped, my identity as a hospice social worker. So I think that there's a lot more losses than we think. And we naturally think about the loss of individuals that have gotten COVID and died as certainly very profound and very, very emotional for all of us. I think it's 1 in 500 people now in the United States have died from COVID. So it's very overwhelming. I know it is for me, and I see death and dying every day. And so what I want to talk about first is sort of the if you can say normal or the usual trajectory of grief, which is that you have a loss. And if you have a healthy ego and you have some strength, you have a community that comes around you and supports your loss. You can have a funeral, you can have Shiva, you can have a memorial service, and the connection of the community is very, very important. And the witnessing of your grief is very important. I think that people need to be witnessed when they have any kind of trauma. And when that's removed, people are bereft of that connection. And if you think about COVID, the one thing that people were not able to do was have a funeral, get together with loved ones, hug, bring food to people, all the rituals that we have to cope with death and dying. And eventually you have the loss, and then eventually, hopefully, you sort of integrate it into you, and the world shifts and you adapt and you go on with your life sort of through the pain. You go on with your life knowing that the world's changed, you've changed, and you sort of adopt your way of living, not having that person in your life anymore. And it's not that simplistic, but that's the gist. I think with COVID, what's been so pervasive is the many losses, because you can grieve the loss of identity, the loss of social connections, the loss of faith in our economic structure. If I look around, I'm looking at my notes because I have stuff written everywhere. So I'm the Post-it queen. So I'm just going to look over here. And we have a collective sorrow of all these losses on top of the losing of individuals. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because I hear everybody say, I want to get back to normal. I want the normal. When are we going to get back to normal? Well, it may never be normal. And how do we adjust for that? Well, we need to grieve the loss. Maybe we'll need to wear masks for the rest of our lives. Maybe we'll have to, deal with another variant coming in. I don't know if there's a way of getting back to normal, just like a person who has the loss of a husband or a wife. Their life is never normal again, but hopefully eventually they can remember that person with love and affection and not a lot of pain, I think is the best you can hope for. So, and it's a living loss because it's ongoing. It's still happening. Every day we hear about more and more people that have died. The southern states are really suffering. The healthcare workers are suffering. everybody's grieving, and I don't know what's going to be in place to help, I think, everybody cope with the grief of the losses that have been brought up by COVID. The people that have lost during the height of the first pandemic anyway, were forced to mourn their losses in isolation. And from my experience and all my reading, it's the connection with people that helps people through the loss. That connection, that community that comes around, that the witnessing of the loss, and that was ripped out from under people with the event of COVID. And I think that can lead into a prolonged or a complicated grief reaction that can go on much longer than needed for the person's well-being. So I think we're all at risk for that, because there's nothing in place to help us cope with the myriad of losses that we suffered through this pandemic and that aren't over yet. Even the loss of routine, like going to the gym or, stopping and grocery shopping every night, those little routines and things that keep you going in life, that's a loss, and that's something that needs to be grieved. Even if it comes back, you're still wounded by that. So I was very interested in the loss of control that COVID brought up, and the loss of predictability, and our faith in our government, and faith in that we're Americans, we can overcome anything. And COVID was very stubborn initially. We didn't know if we were going to have a vaccine. So I guess I'll stop there, because I'm sort of rambling right now, but and hopefully this all makes sense. But I think the takeaways are grief is a reflection of a connection that's been lost. And it doesn't matter what that connection is, as long as it's something that you've invested in, or that you care about, that you love, that you have a lot of emotional energy and connected to. Grief must be witnessed. It really needs to be witnessed by other people. I think the greatest gift we can give anybody going through any kind of loss is to listen. Not to try to fix it or make it better, but just listen. If you ever see a 4-year-old fall down and scrape its knee, don't they come and tell you the story 45 times? They're trying to discharge the trauma, and they need a witness to validate themselves. Yes, it was bad, and yes, mommy made it better, but it was awful. I think that we as adults do the same thing with our own grief. Grief needs a community, which is something that COVID robbed us of for a while. I need that sense of community and coming together. And when you're grieving, you're in pain. You're in a lot of pain, but the suffering comes from your mind. The suffering is what we do when we say to ourselves, oh, I wish I had, been nicer to that person, or I wish I had done this, or what if I had forced my way into the hospital to see them? Those are the things that cause suffering and need to be talked about, I think. When I think back into going into nursing homes, I think of the people that were stuck in there with the elderly people in their rooms with very limited contact with people, and how a lot of people declined and died because of that. So the never underestimate the importance of that human connection. Okay, so now I'll shut up. So now I'll be quiet.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was wonderful. Thank you for your many reflections. And now we will move over to Carol, please.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight. And Pat, I just can't echo enough the piece of importance when we are able to witness and to be witnessed in our grief, how important that is. So if you're here with us today, I trust it is because you are well acquainted with grief. For some of you, it might be the recent death of someone in your life, a central person, and no matter how that death occurred. For others, it might be the amorphous cumulative grief of the pandemic. There's no one on the planet whose life has not been dramatically changed by the pandemic, some more than others. Perhaps you have a family member or a close friend who died from COVID, or perhaps you yourself had COVID and lived in fear that you might die from it or transmit it to someone you love. Maybe a central person in your life died during the pandemic, but not from COVID, and the necessary restrictions of the pandemic affected your loved ones dying and your grieving process as well. Maybe you lost your livelihood or home or sense of security as a result of the pandemic, and you are now carrying the grief of these losses as well. Although we never get to choose when we or someone we love will face the end of life, or when we will find ourselves in the depths of grief, it has become all too clear that this unprecedented time of the pandemic has been the worst time imaginable for anyone to die or to grieve. Without exception, every aspect of dying and grief has been heightened during the pandemic. About 80% of us will die from a final illness rather than a sudden death. Although some would disagree, not all deaths are tragic or traumatic. Many deaths come from natural causes at the end of a long life, expected and shared with loving family and friends. Many anticipated deaths from a final illness, especially those in which hospice care is part of the end-of-life process, can be peaceful, meaningful, even beautiful. Our assumptive world core beliefs tells us this is possible and that there will be services provided and pieces in place in our culture to help and support us during this major life event. We have come to expect a certain level of care, support, and guidance when we need it. The pandemic has shattered our assumptive world, leaving people disoriented and living in a state of panic, changing how we view ourselves and the world. Whether a COVID death occurs at home or in the hospital, patients are struggling to breathe and isolated because of the risk of infection. It generally happens randomly, quickly, and dramatically, and people suffer a great deal, both the patient and the people who love them. COVID deaths are not peaceful, meaningful, or beautiful. The circumstances surrounding these deaths are always tragic and traumatic, and the grief that follows will be traumatic as well. Of course, not all deaths during the pandemic have been COVID related. These patients also often died in hospitals, long-term care facilities, or hospices with limited or no visitors allowed due to the COVID restrictions. Due to necessary COVID travel restrictions, many family members who lived at a distance were unable to travel to say goodbye to their loved ones or be together to support each other as a family. The negative impact of this on a person's grieving process cannot be overstated. The wide range of symptoms that naturally manifest in our feelings, behaviors, and our bodies during grief are now greatly magnified. Normal manifestations of grief when there is no pandemic include confusion, forgetfulness, the inability to focus, resentment, feelings of isolation and abandonment, guilt, regret, loneliness, fear, and profound sadness. In 30 years of doing this work as a grief counselor, I've never had a client, to a greater or lesser extent, who didn't experience these aspects of grief when losing a central person in their life. This is what it means to be human. Now, with the added burden of the pandemic and the emotional complications it brings, many find themselves paralyzed by their grief in ways they likely would not have been prior to the pandemic. More than 675,000 people in the US have died from COVID since the early spring of 2020. A poll taken in March of this year by the Associated Press Center for Public Affairs Research found that approximately 20% of people surveyed in the US had lost a relative or close friend to COVID. It's estimated that each COVID death leaves approximately 9 close relatives deeply bereaved. That means there is a potential bereaved population today of about 65 million people, with several million of those suffering from a psychiatric state called prolonged grief disorder, and also referred to as complicated grief. The loss of a central person in our lives and the deep grief that follows when there is no pandemic leaves one feeling isolated and lonely, even when surrounded by the people we love. This feeling of isolation and loneliness has been greatly magnified during the pandemic, especially when the griever has been unable to be with their loved one during the dying process and spent long periods of time living alone and confined to their home during the grieving process. The lack of contact with a loved one before or during death adds to the likelihood that the bereaved will ruminate on alternative outcomes, the could have, should have, would have thinking that is a common part of the grieving process. With COVID deaths and grief, this aspect is greatly magnified, often causing the griever to get stuck, unable to process the death, accept the reality of the loss, and begin to move forward in their grief, even in the tiniest of ways. A sizable number of these bereaved individuals will find the depth of their anguish does not diminish over time and leaves them incapacitated by their grief, frequently unable to hang on to their jobs or tend to the care of other loved ones who might be dependent on them. Even those who are able to navigate some small tasks of everyday life describe their agonized existence as just waiting to die. Unable to have any movement in our grief means we are unable to eventually move toward healing. The health implications of prolonged grief disorder can be serious. It can exacerbate suicidal ideation and substance misuse. It is also linked to systemic damage to the body, including higher levels of inflammation, which has been linked to cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, and greater susceptibility to infections. Long-term psychological and social distress has been found to lead to what is called weathering in the body, a harmful, well-established state of prolonged biological stress that predisposes people to greater disease risk and earlier health decline. In hospice, we say, we die the way we have lived, and the same is true of grief. We all have our own unique nature and coping mechanisms. No one in a family grieves in exactly the same way, often leaving family members feeling misunderstood and judged, which generally adds another layer to a person's grief. One member of a family might be what is called an instrumental mourner, someone who approaches grief in an analytical way, wanting to take action with what they see as a problem needing to be solved, and might sometimes be referred to as an avoidant coper. An intuitive mourner is someone who is comfortable with strong emotions and tears and sensitive to their own feelings and the feelings of others. They do not try to avoid their grief and are sometimes referred to as approach copers. Dissonant mourners are conflicted between the way they feel and experience their grief internally and how they express it outwardly, causing others to see them as cold and not grieving at all. The differences between each person's grief are also heightened during the pandemic. In grief, we are more irritable and easily annoyed, lacking the tolerance for others we might have had before we are tried by our grief. And because people are often more judgmental of each other for the way they grieve, leading family members to feel even more isolated, abandoned, and lonely. None of these ways of grieving are right or wrong or good or bad. They just are. I'd like to share with you what our bereavement program has looked like during the pandemic. All of our in-person bereavement services were suspended in mid-March of 2020. This essentially remains the case today as well. We moved quickly to connect by phone with all the clients we had been seeing on a regular basis, clients who had upcoming grief counseling sessions already scheduled, as well as new bereavement clients we follow up with every day. Explaining our pandemic policy, we offered to meet with them via Zoom, FaceTime, or by phone. Without exception, everyone wanted to continue receiving grief support. No one said they would rather stop their sessions if they couldn't be in person. To my surprise, the majority of clients, regardless of age, agreed to Zoom or FaceTime visits, including those who said they were fearful of technology. Only a handful of clients wanted sessions by phone. Some clients were already familiar with Zoom or FaceTime, and we were able to move quickly to the virtual format within days. Those who had never used Zoom or FaceTime enlisted the help of an adult child, grandchild, or neighbor so they could venture into the world of virtual grief support. I've been amazed by their willingness and courage to take on something they had never done before, especially at a time when they are deeply grieving, when even the most common everyday tasks can feel insurmountable, a time when most people don't have the emotional energy to take on anything new. Without a pandemic, everything about grief is overwhelming and disorienting in those early weeks and months. With a pandemic, every aspect of grief is magnified, every aspect. We were at the halfway point in 2 of our 8-week bereavement support groups when the pandemic hit and the groups came to a halt. My bereavement colleague and I tried to figure out how we could move the groups to a Zoom format as quickly as possible, reaching out to those people whose groups ended abruptly and wanting to meet the needs of those who had already registered for upcoming groups. 1 month into the pandemic, 12 people signed up for our first Zoom support group, and we quickly discovered this virtual platform was every bit as moving, meaningful, effective, and healing as our in-person groups, with the most glaring exception being there were no hugs at the end of a session, no clusters of people gathering in the parking lot after the group ended to continue sharing their stories or figure out if anyone wanted to go out to get dinner. Since the pandemic started 19 months ago, we have now completed a dozen 8-week bereavement support groups, 3 6-hour healing through writing workshops, 3 loss-specific groups for parents who have experienced the death of an adult child, our annual hospice memorial service, Twilight in the Park, and our Trail of Memories at the Gosnell Memorial Hospice House in Scarborough, all via Zoom. For most participants, these bereavement offerings were the only form of honoring their loved one and their own grief that they had been able to have since their person died. They have spoken about how meaningful these virtual memorial services have been for them, and they have expressed their gratitude. Not only has technology allowed us to continue our bereavement work in the community with both Hospice of Southern Maine and non-HSM clients, it has also allowed us to serve families we would normally never reach from all over the US and beyond. Our clients have included a woman living in Paris whose mother died in Colorado. A woman from North Carolina attended one of our Healing Through Writing workshops, and her sister from New York attended one of our 8-week bereavement support groups. A woman from the San Francisco Bay Area attended 2 of our bereavement support groups after her husband of 30 years died. Another client whose husband died under our care at the start of the pandemic eventually moved to Amsterdam to be close to her daughter. Thanks to technology, she and I continued individual grief counseling for the first year of her husband's death. A young woman in her 20s was able to participate in individual grief counseling from Hawaii after the death of her father. A woman whose mother died in Maine was able to receive grief counseling at her home in Seattle, Washington. Approximately 20% of our individual grief counseling services are provided to community clients, someone whose loved one did not die under the care of Hospice of Southern Maine. In general, community clients have lost their person to an unexpected death, often having died in the hospital, and often traumatic, sudden deaths, either in an accident, by suicide, drug overdose, or COVID. My first community client during the pandemic was a woman whose husband was among the earliest people in Maine to die from COVID. She was referred to me through the palliative care program at Maine Medical Center, and we started meeting on FaceTime 1 week after her husband died. Hers was what was quickly becoming the classic COVID story of dropping her husband off at the doctor's office because he had a bad cough. She went to park the car, and when she got back to the doctor's office, they wouldn't let her inside, and said he had gone by ambulance to the hospital. She never saw him again. Neither of them imagined he could die, and they never said goodbye. For several weeks, my client said she only left the sofa to use the bathroom. In keeping with statistics across the country, I've also seen an increase in suicide and drug-related grief during the pandemic. I met for several months with a young woman in Oregon whose best friend took her life 3 weeks into the pandemic. A woman in New York City whose brother took his life, and several clients in Maine who lost their person to a drug overdose or suicide during the pandemic. It feels good to know we can still provide quality bereavement services virtually to anyone who wants it, that we haven't had to turn anyone away due to COVID restrictions. Throughout the time of the pandemic and all the many ways it so negatively impacts the dying and grieving process, I continue to be moved on a daily basis by people's willingness to reach out and accept support, by my clients' eventual ability to navigate their grief in the pandemic world, their capacity for resiliency, and their ability to little by little find their way closer to a life where meaning and joy are once again possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol, for your comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much. We now move to Jeffrey Pelkey. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, and a great big thank you to Hospice Help Foundation for all you do, and to the public library. I mean, the public library in every community is really what I consider the hub of all good information. I was a huge beneficiary of the library growing up, and I think many of us in my generation were. Much of what Carol just shared with us, I can echo from a different perspective. What we found is that when COVID hit really quite suddenly, we had a small inkling before it became really publicly noticed, because we were starting to see trends in deaths in the city. I had been in Manhattan just a few weeks before the COVID restrictions were placed, and talked with a lot of the folks down there, and we could see something was happening, but I don't think anybody really knew A, what it was, or B, the long-lasting and dramatic effect it would have on the entire world. And we were faced with unimaginable changes seemingly overnight. I myself have enjoyed a wonderful relationship with hospice for almost 32 years as a volunteer, then as a trainer, and then on the board of directors. And I've trained literally hundreds of folks here in our facility to do the wonderful work that hospice does. And as a funeral service practitioner, our connection with hospice is absolutely one of the most important relationships that we can have. And we found that we relied on hospice more during COVID than we ever did prior. And hopefully that relationship will continue. One of the things we found is that we had to retool the way we do everything we do as a funeral service provider, from bringing folks into our care, to serving the families, to serving the families after. And we too, as Carol did, embraced technology very quickly. If you had said to me, in 1985, when I got into the funeral industry, that I would be doing funeral arrangements on the internet by computer without ever being with the family personally and touching them and embracing them and being there for them, I would have thought it would be something out of a sci-fi channel. And lo and behold, 19 months ago, here we were, facing a situation where we couldn't have people come out. They weren't even allowed on the road. We still had the need. We had a loss that we had to support families through, and we didn't quite know how we were going to do that. We, like many manufacturing companies, didn't have a chance to stop the presses and send our employees home and retool the way we do things, we had to immediately learn how to continue to serve people at the most difficult time in their life, now magnified with the loss of human contact. Everything that we encourage people to reach out for to support them was now gone. And we had to fill in those gaps the very best way we could. And that was through doing it ourselves personally. So the hour that I used to spend with a family was now turned into many calls in the evening, just checking in to see how they're holding up. It was asking folks at their place of worship to fill in for the daughter that couldn't fly in from Washington State, and call this person and spend some time on the phone with them because they wanted to, not because they had to. And I think that was one key. The other situation that we face a lot is funerals that we know are going to happen ahead of time because folks will call us and share with us that this loss is impending. And quite often we hear from folks when we go to their home, hospice has been here for 2 days. They were wonderful for us, and we were so blessed to have them. And what we've tried to do with families since 19 months ago is engage hospice earlier. Hospice has a wealth of tools and support for families that they often engage way too late. And they could have benefited oftentimes months before the death occurs. And what we found is those people that engaged hospice earlier didn't experience any less trauma at the time, but they were better prepared for it. They had the support and the knowledge of, I call them angels, the hospice nurses and workers that had to go to the houses. And they were able to impart on these families tools and ways to cope that they never, ever could have gotten any other way. And so I think hospice has been a really important part of what we do to serve our families, and will continue to be, obviously. The other issue we faced is that half of my staff is over 60, and if you'll recall, 60 seemed to be that magic number when they didn't want them to be out at all. And so half of my staff went home 19 months ago and only returned after they were vaccinated. And so that left half of the staff to do 3 times the support for families that we had normally done. And so we had to think on our feet. We had to spend a lot of extra time at work. I myself spent almost 2 months in a hotel away from my family for fear of cross-contaminating my home. My wife is a trauma nurse at a local hospital, and she as well. We didn't know, we had so very little knowledge at the outset of this that we chose to live separately. And what we found is that we personally experienced a loss in that relationship that we have. And it's kind of an almost accidental training. It helped us to understand just a little bit more of what our families were going through. And so we were able to share with them how we felt. And I think that that made what they were going through real. And anytime you can add reality to any situation people are in, I think it also brings them clarity. The other piece that we tried to encourage people to do is to not dilute the way that they remember their loved one just because they couldn't have the human contact that they were used to plan the events, to find ways to execute them, to have just as important of an event for their loved one, even if there were only 2 people. And I myself, right in the middle of the pandemic, lost my grandmother, who was very important in raising me. And I had to face the choices that the families that I serve every day had to face. And so we had 9 people at her funeral because 10 people was the limit at the time. And we had just as important of an event for her. We had just as important readings. We celebrated her life because her life was just as important for us 9 people in attendance as it would have been for 900. And then we set out for the task, which I've encouraged a lot of families do, is to plan for the future. Don't let that event that you're forced to have be the only event you will ever have. And I think when any of us are ever occupied with planning an event, it also helps bring us a sense of calmness. I don't like the word closure. I think it's overused, and I've never been a fan of it, and I never will be. But I think what planning another event later on down the road does is it gives you a chance to put into writing, to put into thought, and to have a redo that a lot of people don't ever have. And so rather than look at it as a negative, which is that postponing the event, we try and share with people that this is their second chance to do the things that they would like to do for their loved one, whether it's 6 months, 9 months, we didn't know if it would be a year or 2 years. And now we've entered that phase where we're starting to do those events. And many families have come back and said, I'm in a very, very different place today than I was 19 months ago. And thank goodness you encouraged me to spend the time and not forget, fill in the blank, and to spend some time thinking about what I would do for them in the future. The future is here, we're doing these events, and I don't think it's bringing closure because, as I just said, I don't like that word, but I think it's giving them a second chance to feel like they're a part of something else. The crowds can be a little bigger, although right now we're starting to see that dip again. People are starting to be able to have that human interaction, even though the touch is still mostly absent, but that interaction is there. And so we're reaching back to the people that we served 19 months ago, and we're having another conversation with them about where they are, where they'd like to be, and how we can help them get to where they want to be. And it's been a challenge. We've had some great support. We've had some wonderful clergy in the Seacoast region that have really stepped up and stepped outside of what their normal role as a clergy person is. And they've become partners in helping people make those plans for the future. So that rather than wishing they had done something in the past, they're anticipating something in the future. And as we all know, the night before Christmas, anticipation can be pretty exciting. And although it's anticipating something that celebrates a tremendous loss in their life, it's still an anticipation of giving that person what they felt they should have had 19 months ago. And so rather than wiping the slate clean and starting over, we're encouraging them to do those things again and reset, if there's a word that can be attached to grief, but reset the way they celebrated that almost 2 years ago. The other component that has been a real important factor for us is our first responders. As the chaplain for the City of Portsmouth Police and Fire, and Newington and South Berwick, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I've spent a tremendous amount of time with our first responders, because the grief that we experience as loved ones is also felt by our first responders. When our first responders are present with someone who is losing their battle, losing their life, the last 19 months, oftentimes, they have been the only ones there. And for them, not only does that experience become amplified by not having the other support that they normally do, but it also brings to light the circumstances in their own lives and amplifies that for them. They don't have the option of not coming into work. They don't have the option of family medical leave and staying home. They didn't have the option of collecting unemployment and going back to work when work reopened. They were there every single day of every single month, of every single hour of this pandemic. And so for me, in the role I served there, it's been important to give them some of the tools that they need to serve the families that all of us tonight collectively serve. And so I think, each of us have done whatever we could by somewhat grasping at the edge of the table. But if we look at everybody that's gathered here tonight collectively, I think as grief resources, we've provided some wonderful support to families that really, really need it. And all of us are invested in serving them for the future, because none of us have gone through a pandemic before. None of us have had to have the extent of delayed grief that we're going to experience. And I think the next 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years are going to be just as important to engage these families that have experienced these losses as the last 19 months have been. So I hope that everyone that's been able to be here tonight and everyone that will see this in the future can glean just a little bit of information from it, that it opens up a dialogue for you, and that if you're suffering or you know someone that is suffering, it has given you an opportunity to find some folks out there that are more than willing to step up and help you through it so you don't have to experience it alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you so much for your perspective. At this point in time, we have about 10 or so minutes, a little bit longer. And Heather from the library is fielding questions. Heather, if you'd like to do that. And then just a friendly reminder for the survey at the end, if you folks have a moment, the library appreciates you doing that.
Oh, yes, feel free to put a question in the Q&A or as well as in the chat if you have anything you'd like to ask. And Marsha Filion, the Executive Director of Hospice Help Foundation, I wanted to thank you for all that you've done. And you also included some resources in an email that we can include in the follow-up email if you would like. And I wanted to welcome you to say anything. I'm sorry that I didn't introduce you in the beginning, but I just wanted to thank you.
Great, thank you. You know, and this has been really interesting, packed with information. You know, my focus is on helping hospice patients, but of course the aftermath are the surviving family members and what they have to deal with. And for me, going through the crazy time of the pandemic, it's been such a comfort to know that, you know, hospice has made it possible for family members to be by the side of loved ones. You know, I think we were all struck with horror at the thought of not being able to say that final goodbye, and to never be able to, you know, hold the hand of a loved one as they're dying. So I appreciate all your work on that front as well, the participants, and you know, what really struck me was, you know, Carol, your description of what people are going through with grief. And I was wondering, I have my own question, which is that, you know, in America, normally, you know, we have this culture of really trying to sort of soldier on and forge ahead. And, you know, we've had a little bit less of that and a little bit more introspection and acknowledgement of, you know, well-being since the pandemic. But I wondered if there were some, you know, and I'd love all your thoughts on this, if there are some telltale signs when someone is grieving, or, you know, maybe just even for people who are trying to suppress it and it's coming out in surprising ways. You know, if there's anything that would make people sort of stop and say, oh, wait a minute, these are the clear telltale signs. I'm not just cranky and irritable since 2020. I'm actually experiencing loss. You know, is there anything that would like help people make that realization?
You know, I think we often talk in grief about things like anger. Is grief coming out sideways? And especially anger is a very common, normal piece of grief. But for some people, it is very intense and long lasting. And a family member might say, you know, my son, my daughter, my mate, my whatever, they're not normally like this. I don't know what's going on. And I sometimes am surprised, and I shouldn't be, when people don't make a connection when there has been the death of a central person in their family, or if it's more of that amorphous, all the losses of the pandemic. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that family went through the death of a central person during this time. I'm thinking of children who are so much more clear about when something's going on. I had a client today whose mother died, And my client is a young woman in her 30s and very distraught, and actually been wrestling with suicidal ideation since her mom died. And she has a 6-year-old, and he's been really acting out. And she said she asked him in the car when she was taking him to school, "What's going on, bud? You know, can you help me understand what's going on?" And right away, without hesitation, he said, "I miss Mimi. And I'm sad that she's not here. And I'm mad that she's not here. And when I felt sad or mad, she always made me feel better." And I just thought, boy, if only we as adults could say, well, here's what's going on. I make this connection. You know, so kids are incredible grievers.
Marsha, you know, we reconnect with our families as a rule in the funeral industry anyways, but the last 19 months, we've made an effort to reconnect with them much more often, especially myself, where I was born and raised in these communities. And what I'm finding is people are sharing with me the very simplest reasons that they're suffering, and it's lack of appetite, lack of ability to get out and get up and get moving, all the things that we as grief experts, for lack of a better term, understand as grief. And they'll say something to me like, "I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't eat. I'm not interested in fill in the blank." And sometimes I just take a minute and I say to them, "You and I are having this conversation because you just experienced one of the most difficult losses in your life. Do you think that might be the reason you're not eating, or it might be the reason you no longer want to go for a walk?" And all of a sudden, it's like somebody pulls the chain on the light and it pops on. And then the question to them is, what do they do next? And that's what we're struggling with. Is pre-pandemic, we could say to them, this is where you need to go to get some support. Here's the place you need to be. Right now, we are really struggling with what the answer for them is. And so we've had to recreate a lot of different things. And maybe it's, why don't you and I talk every single day at 10 o'clock? Or why don't you and your pastor come up with a contract where you talk every day at 10 o'clock? Get some normalcy back into your life, even if it's just one thing. And so that's kind of what we've had to resort to.
That's great. And I loved the fact that you were giving people a chance to re-celebrate the memory of someone who has passed or died. We have, for part of our fundraiser, we've often had a Day of the Dead ceremony, and it's been something that I really have been interested in. I really love, because again, we have this culture of sort of moving on and progressing, and I think it's so important to be able to celebrate the people who were in our lives and no longer are, just to make sure that we're honoring them and we're holding them close, and there's no fear that we're going to forget them or leave them behind. I wonder if more people will do this now, especially the people who had a chance to have another celebration 19 months later. I wonder if they're going to be like, I really love that. Let's make this an annual thing.
Well, I talk to a lot of people, and when a death immediately occurs, I tell them very much up front, you've just gone on to autopilot, and your body, regardless of what you want to do, is doing everything it needs to do to just get through the next minute, hour, day, week, month. And when we revisit folks a year later, 19 months later, and find that autopilot has gone off, there's a sense of clarity that comes back to them, and they're able to be more present in however they choose to remember their loved one. And more people have come back to me and said, we know that we were forced to do this later, but what a gift. As hard as it's been the last 19 months, we just did things we never would have done 19 months ago because we couldn't think straight enough to do it. And so I think if there is any unintended positive consequence, it's that people won't forget that this person needs to remain as part of their life, even though theirs is gone. And at those celebrations, at those family events, make them still be a part of it. And I think that's been maybe a positive unintended consequence.
There is a question from Susie, who is asking, you all do such a wonderful job. Who is there to support you through all of this? Maybe share some ways that you can find yourself taking care of yourself during these times and times of change.
I find for both myself and I would have to say the majority of my colleagues, I know they would agree if I had this conversation at work, that we do a good job talking about self-care, but we often don't do such a good job practicing it ourselves. And that is so important. The things that I know that I do, whether it's writing is something I find really helpful in taking care of myself. And I also meet on a regular basis with a fellow counselor, therapist, and we provide supervision for each other. So it's an opportunity where we can bring up those aspects of what we've encountered during the week that might touch us more deeply than our everyday experiences in the work. There's always going to be things that and situations that affect any hospice worker more deeply than others. So talking about it to me is the very best thing we can do. And in the same way Pat talked about having someone bear witness, the same is true about the work that you do.
Heather, I think for me, you know, the work that I do has historically been very stressful without a pandemic, as everybody else's here is. And for me, my faith has been the cornerstone of my strength. And I think that throughout the entire pandemic, I've been able to hold on and strengthen my faith. And those people that support me in that have really allowed me to share that with others and to have them share that with me. My pastor, Beth Hoffman from Elliott, has been probably one of the most important people in my life. She's my sounding board, and I think I offer her a sounding board. And I think without her, getting through the last 19 months probably would have happened, but it would not have happened as well as it has. The other piece is public service. Being a firefighter and a chaplain and a pastor in a local church, it allows me to talk with all of those people and share back and forth. So it's not just listening ears, but it's the talking as well. And lastly, probably most importantly, is my wife. You know, I have a wonderfully strong marriage of 35 years. I don't know how she's married me for 35 years, but I'm blessed that she has. And her being a trauma nurse and me being in the work I do, we've been able to be wonderful sounding boards for each other at home. So I think those three things have really sustained me.
We have about a minute left. Pat, would you like to add anything?
Well, I was thinking of Susie's question, what do I do? And I think that I'm like Carol, I do talk to a fellow counselor and try to process my feelings and stay on top of them, and so I don't carry them into the room with me when I see patients. And my big coping mechanism, which I don't have right now, is I always had a dog. And I don't have one right now, and I really feel the loss of that. But that really, really helped me cope. And it was a dog I took to see patients. She was a therapy dog. And I meditate. I meditate every day, and I pray a lot. And I pray a lot during the day. And and especially when I find myself in a situation where I'm not quite sure what to say or do, I just sit there for a minute and just ask for help.
Thank you so much.
Well, it is 7:30 and the hour has gone by so quickly. I wanted to make sure if anyone wanted to say a few words before the evening ends. Would anyone care to say anything?
I just want to thank
the
everybody.
opportunity.
The kindest group of people. Yes. Would it say any words before I thank you all for all that you've done? Especially, I'm so deeply grateful for all of you. Anne and Marsha, thank you. for connecting everybody and all of the time and energy of Hospice Health Foundation and gathering this incredible group of humans together. Thank you. Thank you, Carol, Jeffrey, and Pat, so much for your insights. This has been really such a wonderful evening of retrospective and thoughts and reflection. So I really appreciate all of the time that you've taken planning for this, as well as for your evening tonight. So thank you very much. There will be a follow-up email for everyone who has attended. So that will include resources as well as the links and the transcript of tonight's talk, as well as a link to this will go up on our YouTube channel as well, but we'll send you a link for that as well. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Take
night.
care.
Well,
Bye-bye.
take care.
Bye.